Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in. This is Sharon from String Theory Yarn Company, and today I'm going to teach you how to make the Frida flower. This is a crocheted flower that's great for embellishing scarves and hats and sweaters. You can make headbands out of it. Really anything that you want to add a little bit of pizzazz to, this is a great choice. Today I'm using the Entropy Chunky yarn from Feederbrook Farm, which is available to purchase at String Theory. Since it is a chunky weight yarn, I'm using an H or 8 crochet hook. But really you can use any weight yarn and corresponding crochet hook that you want to, just keeping in mind that the thicker the yarn, the bulkier the flower is going to be, and it'll be a little bit more rigid. If you want something more flexible and a little bit more delicate, you can certainly use a finer weight yarn and a corresponding crochet hook for that. So let's get started by making a slip knot, and then we're going to chain 3. And then we are going to do 6 double crochets into the first chain. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Don't worry, they will all fit in there. That stitch is pretty stretchy. And then we're going to join with a slip stitch into the top of the first double crochet that we made. And the easiest way to be sure which stitch that is to just count back from your needle. So this would be stitch 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that stitch right there is, if you can see that, that's the one that we want to join with the slip stitch. So, and you want to make sure you get under both legs. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There we go, right there. Get under both legs of the stitch and just join with the slip stitch. And there's the center of the flower. And then we are going to chain 2. And we're going to do 3 double crochets into the top of that same stitch. That same double crochet that we slipped into. We're going to do 3 double crochets into there. That's 2 and 3. And then we're going to chain 2. Get this yarn over here. And slip stitch back into that same stitch. This rounds out the petal so that you get a nice round looking petal instead of a squared off block. We want it nice and round and flower shaped. And then we're going to chain 1, and we're going to slip stitch into the top of the next double crochet, like so. And then we're going to chain 2 and do 3 double crochets into that same stitch for petal number 2. 1, 2, 3, and again chain 2 and slip stitch back into that same stitch to round out the petal. And then we'll chain 1 and slip stitch into the top of the next double crochet. You just want to make sure that you get underneath both legs of that stitch. Slip that right there, and then we're going to chain 2, 3 double crochets into that same stitch. And then we're going to chain 2 and slip stitch into that same stitch to round out the petal. Then we'll chain 1 and slip stitch into the top of the next double crochet, like so. Chain 2, 3 double crochets into that same stitch, chain 2, and slip stitch into the same stitch to round out the petal, chain 1, tangle here, and then we're going to slip stitch into the top of the next double crochet and chain 2, 3 double crochets into the top of that same stitch, helps if you get in the right spot. Chain 2, slip stitch into that same stitch again to round out your petal, chain 1, this will be our last petal. We're going to slip stitch into the next top of the next double crochet, and chain 2, and do 3 double crochets into that same, the top of that same stitch. 1, 2, 3, chain 2, and slip stitch to round out that last petal. And then we want to chain 1, and we're going to do a slip stitch into the bottom of that first chain 2 of the round. So that finishes round 1. We've got 6 petals and we're ready to go for round 2. So for round 2, we're going to chain 3, and then we are going to slip stitch into the next chain 1 space between these the flower petals. So you want to get your needle in between those 2 flower petals, and you want to stay behind your petals. We're trying to make a foundation chain that's going to go around the back of the flower. So we want to just pull up a loop and do a slip stitch. So now we've got this chain 3, and we're attached to, we've got a slip stitch into this chain 1 space between these petals. And we're going to do that all the way around the back of the flower. So we're going to chain 3, and we're going to slip stitch into the chain 1 space between the next 2 petals. And again, just go right into that chain 1 space. You're going to have to force your needle in there a little bit if you've got bulky yarn. And it helps if you pinch the flowers together, because that'll keep you in the back of the flower where you want to be. Pinch those 2 petals together. And we're just, whoops, of course. Let me get back in there. We're just doing a slip stitch right in there, and then we'll chain 3, move along to the next chain 1 space between the flower petals and slip into there. See how the chains are, got one chain, another chain, another chain, and we're just gonna go right around the back of the flower. So chain 3 and slip stitch into the next chain 1 space between these petals, keeping that chain behind the petals around the back. Chain 3 and then last one, chain 3 and you're just going to join it into that chain 1 space at the beginning of the round with a slip stitch, like so. So now let me show you what this looks like. Now you've got around the back of the flower, you've got your chains, around the back of the flower. It kind of looks like a stop sign, like a hexagon. Okay. So now this foundation chain is where we're going to attach our second round of petals. So we're going to go around once again, and this time we'll be making petals. So we're going to slip stitch into that chain space, that first chain 3 space. Just do a slip stitch. And then we're going to chain 2. And then we're going to do 5 double crochets into that same chain space. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then we'll chain 2, slip stitch into that same chain 3 space to round out the petal. So you get a nice rounded petal instead of a block. Chain 1, and then we'll slip stitch into the next chain 3 space. And then we'll chain 2 and do 5 double crochets into this chain 3 space. There's 5 double crochets. And then we will chain 2 and slip stitch back into that same chain 3 space to round out the petal, and then chain 1 and slip stitch into the next space, chain 2 and 5 double crochets, and we're going to do this all the way around the flower. Chain 2 and slip stitch back into that same space to round out the petal. Chain 1 and then slip stitch into our next chain 3 space. Again with the chain 2, the 5 double crochets, chain 2, slip stitch. Yes, I lose track too sometimes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 double crochets, and then my chain 2 and my slip stitch in there to make my nice rounded petal. Get over there. Chain 1, slip stitch into the next chain 3 space. Chain 2. 5 double crochets. Three, 4. Okay. Now we're going to chain 4. 2, 3, 4. And we're going to do the same thing that we did on the foundation round for the last round. We are going to slip stitch into that chain 1 space between the next 2 petals. Like so. And then we're going to chain 4. We're just doing this all the way around. 2, 3, 4. Again, keeping these chains behind your petals on the back of your flower, and we're gonna get into that for that chain 1 space between the petals, and just slip stitch that to there, chain 4, and slip stitch into that chain 1 space between the 2 petals. And it really does help to pinch these 2 petals together so you can get a good grip on it. Sort of manhandle this all the way around. 1, 2, 3, 4, and we're just doing this around the back of the flower just like we did for the foundation row for the row before. And slip stitch into that chain 1 space like so. And I'll show you this really quick. So you've got your chains and they're attached between the flower petals, and this is going to be the foundation for the petals for our 3rd row. So we're just going to do that all the way around. Chain 4. And slip stitch into that chain 1 space between the 2 petals. Like so. So you get around to the end and just slip stitch into that same chain 1 space. You might have to force this a little bit. Sometimes crochet can get brutal. Okay, now I'll show you what this looks like. So you've got your chains going all the way around, those 4 chains going all the way around the back of your flower for the foundation for our last row of petals. So this really is such a simple flower, and it's very easy to memorize, honestly. We're just going to do the same thing that we did when we were stitching our petals onto the last row, we're going to slip stitch into the chain 4 space, like so, and then we're going to chain 2 and do 6 double crochets into this chain 4 space. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Chain 2 and slip stitch into that same space to round out that petal neatly, and then we're going to chain 1, slip stitch into the next chain 4 space, like so, chain 2, 6 double crochets into this chain 4 space, and we're just going to do this all the way around the flower. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Chain 2, slip stitch back into that same chain 4 space to round out the flower. See, and you can see how nice and rounded it is. It looks like a flower petal. It's nice. Chain 1, slip stitch into the next chain 4 space, chain 2, 6 double crochets, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, add some more yarn here, 6, chain 2, and slip stitch into that same chain 4 space to round out the petal, chain 1, slip stitch into the next chain 4 space, chain 2, 6 double crochets. If you haven't guessed by now, this lovely little flower is quite the yarn eater. It takes a decent amount of yarn to make them, but they are a wonderful little stash buster, that's for sure. Let's see how many we've got here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Chain 2, slip stitch into the same chain 4 space to round out the petal, chain 1, slip stitch into the next chain 4 space. I thought it was at the end, but I'm not. 1, 2 chains, 6 double crochets into this same space. Let's like untangle the yarn here, thank you. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Chain 2, slip stitch into that same chain 4 space, chain 1, slip stitch into our last chain 4 space here, chain 2, 6 double crochets into this last chain 4 space. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Home stretch. Chain 2. Do that last slip stitch into that chain 4 space to round out that last petal, and then join it into the first chain 1 space of the beginning of the round with a slip stitch. And there you are. One beautiful flower. Well done. Then all you need to do is fasten off, and you've got your beautiful flowers. If you use a gorgeous yarn like this that has a lot of color to it, I'll show you the rest of the skein that I've got rolled up. All of these flowers are going to come out a little bit different from the other ones. You can make a whole bouquet of them. They're absolutely gorgeous. I really love this yarn. But if you want solid color flowers, then you can use a single color yarn. But enjoy and happy flowering. Go Frida!